Neurological Disorders, Lesson 5.4. How is dopamine involved in addictive behaviors? The goals of this lesson are to provide a glimpse into the research being conducted in scientific labs and to provide an opportunity to conduct a virtual experiment, including data collection, analysis, and communication. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to distinguish between the seeking and consuming phases of drug use and addictive behaviors, and describe the role of dopamine in both the seeking and consuming phases of addictive behaviors. We'll achieve these goals with a virtual cocaine lab. To prepare for this lesson, you'll need to review the key scientific concepts that will be presented in it. They include the phases of addictive behaviors, including the appetitive or seeking phase and the consumatory phase, the methods of studying dopamine signaling in addictive behaviors, including intracranial self-stimulation, microdialysis, and fast-scan cyclic photometry, and dopamine signaling in appetitive or seeking and consumatory phases of addictive behaviors. You can review the scientific content in the background reading provided to you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides in-depth knowledge about the scientific content presented in the lesson. The teacher manual or lesson plan provides a minute-by-minute explanation of lesson structure, including instructions on how to manage the discussion and activity, and the student workbook provides additional explanations for your students. You'll need to be sure to print the activity worksheets, homework reading, and homework worksheets for your students. You'll also need a computer lab to run the Mind Project's virtual cocaine lab. The lab requires Flash, so you want to be sure that it's installed and up to date. And finally, you'll need to double check that the embedded video on PowerPoint slide number 3 will play on your classroom computer. If you do have problems playing the video within the PowerPoint slide, you can download it from the ND Multimedia Backup. A link to this backup is provided to you on the web page for Lesson 5.4. The key points of the lesson due now are to focus on the hypothesis for the lab, which is that dopamine signaling is involved in cocaine-seeking behaviors. The do now also forces students to predict data that would support the hypothesis, which would be increased dopamine signaling while the rat is seeking cocaine. We get to these key points by reviewing the homework. In the do now, students review last night's homework with a partner, focusing on 2 questions. What hypothesis is this experiment testing? And if the hypothesis is true, what should you observe? The key points of the lesson activity that fast-scan cyclic photometry allows for rapid measurement of dopamine signaling, which will allow us to determine the involvement of dopamine signaling in the phases of addictive behaviors. We'll get to these key points with a virtual cocaine lab. In the virtual lab, students will perform the duties of a scientist: read background information, follow lab procedures, prepare a rat for surgery, conduct the experiment, record observations, and then publish the results. To prepare the class for the lab, give each student a copy of the activity worksheet, which will serve as their lab notebook. Then have the class watch the video embedded on slide number 3, which serves as an introduction and an overview to the lab. As the video is playing, you'll want to highlight some changes to what your students will be required to do. First, your students will not use the virtual lab notebook. Instead, they will use their activity worksheets. Second, your students have already covered the information in books numbers 1 and 2, so they do have to open and close the books. They do not need to take the time to read them during the lab. Once all the students have been introduced to the lab, allow them to work with a partner to complete it. A link to the lab is provided on the web page and within the lesson plan for Lesson 5.4. The lab should take students between 25 and 30 minutes to complete. If students finish more quickly, it's probably because they haven't answered all the questions on their activity worksheet. The key points of the lesson wrap-up are that dopamine levels increase drastically in the nucleus accumbens during the consumatory phase of addictive behaviors, and that dopamine levels increase slightly in the nucleus accumbens during the seeking phase of addictive behaviors. We'll get to this key point by analyzing the data collected during the virtual cocaine lab. In the wrap-up, you'll review 2 of the key data points and findings from the virtual cocaine lab. First, the data on slide number 5 represents a time after the rat has received cocaine, so it's the consumatory phase of addictive behaviors. This data leads to confirmation of the conclusion already known that dopamine levels increase drastically after a rat receives an injection of cocaine. Second, the data on slide 6 represents a time before the rat received cocaine, so the seeking phase of addictive behaviors. Since there is a slight increase in dopamine signaling just before the rat presses the bar, this data supports the hypothesis that dopamine signaling is involved in cocaine-seeking behaviors. The key points of the homework are that dopamine levels increase drastically in the nucleus accumbens during the consumatory phase of addictive behaviors, and that dopamine levels increase slightly in the nucleus accumbens during the seeking phase of addictive behaviors. We'll get to these key points with a homework reading and worksheet. For homework, students will review the experiment by reading an article written with the experimental data and completing a worksheet that has them analyze that data. This lesson is often listed as a favorite among students participating in the curriculum because it's a hands-on lab activity, even if it is virtual. Students often ask for more details about the experiments. You can find more in the teacher primer, teacher manual, and student workbook. One of the most common questions teachers get is, "My animal never self-administered cocaine. Why?" You can use this as a jumping point for a discussion about how science doesn't always work the first time through, but scientists are always repeating experiments for exactly that reason. And that depending on time, the students can either repeat the experiment or share data with another group. It's actually a really good idea to have all the students' groups share out their data, as that's part of the scientific process. At the end of the lesson, students should appreciate not only how some of the scientific experiments are conducted in the lab, but also the involvement of dopamine signaling in both the appetitive or seeking and consumatory phases of addictive behaviors. The results of this lab directly link to the homework reading from Lesson 5.1 on the chocolate milkshake study, since both discuss the activation in the reward pathway just before and just after receiving a reward. This lesson also highlights dopamine's involvement in the phases of addictive behaviors, which may underlie relapse, an issue we'll address later in the unit. Don't forget, if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback to let us know. You can contact any of the CTSE team members, and we'd be more than happy to help you.